Hello readers by eyes and by ears, this is Mari Chan and welcome back to my channel. Today we are continuing with another reading of Copper Coins Volume 1, also known as Tong Qian by Musu Li, and we are covering just one chapter today, and that is Chapter 12, Island Tomb. So I hope you all enjoy. Master, what's wrong? Asked Jiang Shr-neeng. Being a ghost, he possessed a natural advantage over Lu Nianqi. Other than some dizziness and a headache, he hadn't suffered any real injuries from the fall and thus recovered first. When he straightened from his ugly sprawl on the ground, he saw Xuanmin holding a flame and staring at the ground. He was motionless and looked like he'd been stunned. During their limited time together, Xuanmin had always remained calm and unruffled, as if neither fear nor anger could touch him. It was the first time Jiang Shr-neeng had seen him stupefied. Something that could leave even Xuanmin speechless. What kind of horrific situation could that be? Jiang Shr-neeng's heart thumped hard, and apprehension welled up inside him. At Xuanmin's lack of reaction, Jiang Shr-neeng's anxiety only grew. He shot to his feet to take a closer look, but he only managed one step before tripping. Ah! Look where you're going! Lu Nianqi cried out in pain as he jerked his foot back. Sorry, I wasn't paying attention. As Jiang Shr-neeng apologized repeatedly, he turned to see Lu Nianqi huddled with his hands over his head, messy and unkempt, his movements stilted. I stepped on your foot, so why are you holding your head? Jiang Shr-neeng asked. Lu Nianqi kept quiet for a while before saying in a muffled voice, I didn't brace myself properly and landed face first. My forehead's all scraped. Jiang Shr-neeng sighed. His doctor's instinct, momentarily interrupted by the fall, reared its head once more. Can you stand? Did you hurt anything else? I hit my injured hand. It's probably bleeding again. Lu Nianqi shook his head, but he accepted Jiang Shr-neeng's support to stand. I'm fine otherwise. Did that monk, did he find anything? Why isn't he speaking? As he'd lost his parents and older relatives at such a young age, Lu Nianqi's manners were lacking. If not for Xuanmin's small display of ability earlier, he probably wouldn't have rescinded his words and just addressed him as monk. The two injured boys hobbled over to Xuanmin. Xuanmin's unapproachable nature made them afraid to get close, so they stayed half a step away, their necks craned forward like meerkats as they stared at the ground. Xuanmin's talisman must have been enchanted because, despite having burned for quite some time, the paper had not yet been consumed. A small flicker of flame remained at his fingertips. Although dim, it was enough to illuminate the face he was staring at. Jiang Shr-neeng and Lu Nianqi were both shocked into silence. A dying flame, a situation with no way out, and now their companion's severed head was lying in front of them. They might just snap from terror. Moreover, Xueshan's head was face up, the pain still reminiscent of a wide-eyed corpse bleeding from every orifice. It should have added to the sheer horror. However, a thought immediately tumbled into Jiang Shr-neeng's mind. What is this wise one doing now? But then his brain buzzed back to life and reality sank in. His limbs turned cold, and he understood why Xuanmin had stood there, stupefied for such a long time. His head's gone. Is he really dead? Jiang Shr-neeng asked hesitantly. This was a truly unprecedented situation. Xueshan had been chattering non-stop just a moment ago. Who could have imagined that he'd end up decapitating himself? Where's the body? Jiang Shr-neeng continued, stammering. Lu Nianqi hadn't recovered yet. He swiveled his wide-eyed stare toward Xuanmin. Xuanmin didn't speak, nor did his expression flicker. He simply reached into his pouch and pulled out the doll's headless paper body. The once lively doll was motionless in his palm, much like an ordinary sheet of flimsy paper, silent and lifeless. Jiang Shr-neeng opened his mouth but didn't know what to say. Lu Nianqi ended up speaking first. Is he human or a ghost? Can he still survive like this? He should, Jiang Shr-neeng muttered automatically, but he found himself unable to finish. After hesitating for a moment, he picked up the flimsy paper head from the ground and tentatively called out, Xue... Xuexiong, are you awake? If you are, please respond. Footnote number 5, Xiong, a word meaning elder brother, can be attached as a suffix to address an unrelated male peer. Silence. He held his breath for a moment, but still heard no reply. His hand holding Xue Xian's head trembled, and he quickly placed the head in Xuanmin's palm. Can we glue him back together? Lu Nianqi asked stiffly. Like that will work. Have you ever seen anyone reattach their head with glue? Why don't you try it and show me? Jiang Shr-neeng was about to blurt all of that out, but he recalled Lu Nianqi's age and swallowed his words, turning his troubled, distressed gaze back to Xue Xian's decapitated body and head. Only for Xuanmin, who'd been staring at his palm, to finally speak. He's beyond saving. Let's burn him. What? Jiang Shr-neeng and Lu Nianqi exclaimed together. Xuanmin's expression didn't so much as flicker, remaining cold and stern. Seeing that, Jiang Shr-neeng became convinced he was serious, and his legs buckled slightly. Master, you can't mean that. I don't perform rites for paper dolls, said Xuanmin, and his other hand brought the still-burning talisman closer to Xue Xian's paper body. Just as the flame was about to brush the paper, a faint voice chimed next to Xuanmin's ear. Stop right there. You dare. The voice didn't come from the paper doll. Rather, it emanated from the empty void next to Xuanmin's ear. The fretting Jiang Shr-neeng jerked his head up. Staring at Xuanmin, Jiang Shr-neeng circled him several times, too afraid to speak a word, because he couldn't see Xue Xian anywhere. In truth, at the moment the paper body tore in two, Xue Xian's soul had fought his way out of the doll, unwilling to go through that kind of pain again. His soul had no form. Like wind or air, it was wholly invisible, which suited him just fine. Of all the things he could have done, he'd ripped off his own head. The humiliation was too great. He didn't want to see anyone just then, so he gathered himself behind Xuanmin and turned into a trailing shadow. Xue Xian thought that if he floated over and whispered ominously in Xuanmin's ear, he could startle the monk and rattle his composure. Against his expectations, Xuanmin didn't even turn his head. His tone was unsurprised as he asked, Not playing dead anymore? Xue Xian couldn't believe it. As the saying went, everything had its match. Ever since he'd met Xuanmin, Xue Xian felt like he was perpetually on the verge of hacking up all the hypothetical blood in his hypothetical body. How did you know I was playing dead? Displeased that he'd failed, Xue Xian forced the words out through gritted teeth. Xuanmin didn't bat an eyelid as he flipped his palm over and put away the doll he'd been ready to burn. Scourges last for 1,000 years, while the good die young. This sounds so much like Sui Puchu. Oh, God. Xue Xian longed to send Xuanmin on a nice trip to the underworld. However, remembering his situation, Xue Xian tamped down his temper and softened his attitude. Fine. Someone like me shouldn't lower myself to your level. Say whatever you like. At these words, Xuanmin cocked his head a little and glanced at the emptiness by his ear. It seemed he found Xue Xian's new docility rather strange. Xue Xian cleared his throat. His next words would be rather embarrassing, so he paused to muster his courage. He glanced at Jiang Shr-neeng and Lu Nianqi, who had turned to look in the direction he was speaking from, and decided to lower his voice even further. Spirits had no physical form, much like the wind, so Xue Xian's size and shape didn't matter. Shrinking himself down, he drifted around Xuanmin's ear and spoke in a barely audible whisper. Bald donkey, I have a proposal. Xuanmin didn't speak, but he also didn't move, clearly waiting for what he had to say next. I want to borrow your body for a bit, Xue Xian said. Xuanmin remained utterly silent. Xue Xian thought about it and decided his statement came off wrong, so he quickly rephrased it. I don't mean I want to take over your body. I mean, I need a place to stay, preferably right up against your hip. Xuanmin still said nothing. Ugh, why is talking this hard? Xian thought. The reason for his struggle was because spirits couldn't float around aimlessly for too long. He needed to find a physical object to anchor himself to, or he would dissipate. The longer his soul drifted like this, the more it damaged his vitality. He'd worked hard to return his body back to health and had no wish to return to being a quadriplegic. But now that the paper doll had ripped into two, he couldn't possess it. As for why he wanted to stay close to Xuanmin's hip, ever since the marble had ended up in Xuanmin's pouch, Xian had grown increasingly aware of Xuanmin's unique constitution. The dragon couldn't help but think about the bell tolls he'd heard coming from Xuanmin's hip and how they'd left him dizzy and disoriented. Without a doubt, those sounds were connected to the golden marble's transformation. He even began to entertain some flights of fancy. If both he and the marble stayed close to Xuanmin's hip, might he be able to return to his dragon form? Although his dragon form had been stripped of its bones and tendons, with proper nurturing, it might be possible to grow new ones. He wanted to return to his original form as soon as he could, to regrow his bones again. Once that was the case, he would no longer need to haggle and compromise with others the way he was doing now. Forget it. I just need to find something to stay in. Doesn't have to be your hip. Your pouch will do. Xuanmin hadn't even said a word. Yet Xian was making concessions without any prompting. Xuanmin glanced at the emptiness. After all your wailing earlier, you're now asking to go into the pouch? Xian gritted his teeth and grunted reluctantly. Yeah. Just say yes or no. Why? Your bones are special. Xuanmin shook his head, apparently unable to find a response. After some thought, he reached into the pouch and took out Xian's golden marble. He twirled his index finger, and a cut opened itself in his skin, from which a bright red drop of blood oozed. Using the drop of blood as ink, he raised his hand and sketched out a spell on the marble. Xian recognized the spell's design. He'd drawn the same on the paper doll when he'd first anchored himself to it. As Xian finished the final stroke, the marble glowed faintly before dimming once more. Xuanmin reached out to grab at the air where Xian was drifting and tapped the golden marble. Just like that, Xian was pulled inside. He hadn't truly returned to his body. He'd only been anchored to the marble the way he would be to any other ordinary object. It was a temporary dwelling. Even so, he was elated. He had to admit that when Xuanmin wasn't trying to drive him crazy, he was quite tolerable. This single act was the one that mattered to Xian the most, blotting out all else. Going to crawl around still? Xuanmin asked, while putting the golden marble back into his pouch. Huh. My venerable self is round and smooth as glass, with nary a limb in sight. How the hell am I supposed to crawl? Xian thought. However, he just accepted a favor from Xuanmin, so having a go at him right away wouldn't be a good look. Instead, he gave a proper answer. No more crawling. What about blowing everything up with your antics? An angry retort bubbled in Xian's throat, but he ultimately forced it back down. I won't cause more trouble. Seeing that he'd truly become compliant this time, Xuanmin pushed the marble into the bottom of the pouch. With this, Xian really settled down somewhat. After all, he'd promised Xuanmin to behave. He couldn't just go back on his word right away. He had to at least pretend to comply. Plus, Xuanmin really had chosen the best object to subdue him. In the form of a round marble, he couldn't jump even if he wanted to. The most he could do was roll around in the pouch with Xuanmin's movements. Jiang Shr-neeng hadn't heard Xian's bargain, but he'd observed Xuanmin's actions and understood the general situation. He pointed at the pouch. Is he injured? Jiang Shr-neeng relaxed when Xuanmin shook his head. Now that he'd dealt with Xian's unfortunate marble form, Xuanmin finally had time to observe their surroundings. Using a pinch of fire held between his fingers, he partially illuminated the area, revealing an underground stone chamber of unknown origins with a gently sloping floor. Xuanmin turned the paper flame to light up the lower area of the chamber. Two massive shadows were sitting there. Jiang, Shr-neeng, and Lunianqi both shuddered in terror. What are those?" Jiang, Shr-neeng gasped, retreating 2 steps. "Tomb guardians," said Xuanmin. The sloping ground was about 30 yards in length. At the end was a half-open stone door, with a massive beast carved from stone standing on either side. Each was over 10 feet tall, with fierce eyes and stout faces that exuded intimidation. Their glares were directed downward, silently scrutinizing the intruders from above. Fearsome stone beasts of such scale were usually only seen in royal mausoleums. Tomb guardians? Jiang, Shr-neeng had no reason to doubt Xuanmin. A chill ran down his spine, and he rubbed his arms. Could this Funto Island really be a giant graveyard, as its name suggests? Lunianqi turned pale. But I've never heard anyone say that. It's only called Funto Island because it resembles a burial mound. If it really were one, the pharmacist wouldn't dare come here. Xuanmin raised the flame to highlight the faces and feet of the tomb guardians. They're new. How new? Asked Jiang, Shr-neeng. Erected within the last 3 to 5 years. If they'd been carved 3 to 5 years ago, the construction of the tomb must have also happened then. But that was bizarre. Whom had it been built for? Xuanmin swept the light over the area they'd fallen into, then shone it into the fathomless tunnel above. He shook his head. There was no chance of leaving the way they came. Their only choice was to continue forward in search of another exit. After another sweep of light, Xuanmin began to walk. Jiang, Shr-neeng, and Lunianqi were both shivering with fear, but they dared not stray too far from Xuanmin. After hesitating for a moment, they hurriedly caught up, closely following him from behind. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I'm a ghost too, Jiang, Shr-neeng mumbled to himself. He felt a bit better. Xuanmin passed between the 2 gigantic tomb guardians and pushed open the half-closed stone door. Even the oldest, most neglected wooden door would only creak softly when opened, but a stone door was different. As it was pushed open, the hefty stone base ground against the stone floor, causing it to rumble. The sound echoed in the vast and silent tomb, bouncing back and forth until Lunianqi's and Jiang, Shr-neeng's hackles were bristling in fear. Lunianqi clamped his legs together, feeling like he might wet himself. However, his mullish personality wouldn't let him show weakness. He squared his shoulders and took 2 brave steps forward. In an eerie place like this one, he couldn't know if it was safer to walk in front or stay in the back. Right as Xuanmin was about to push the stone door all the way open, it knocked into something with a muffled thud. It seemed to be stuck. There's something behind the door, Lunianqi cried in surprise. Despite his best attempts to quash it, there was a tremor in his voice. Xuanmin did not hurry to investigate what was behind the door. Instead, he used the fire to scan the general area ahead. Lunianqi couldn't help screaming at what he saw. What the hell? The flames revealed another connecting hall similar to the chamber they'd been in, just a little narrower. What had frightened Lunianqi were the walls on either side of the hall covered in paintings of beasts even more terrifying than the tomb gardens. The murals were painted in neither black nor full color, but in crimson. Were they painted with blood? Lunianqi shrieked. Ultimately, he was the youngest and most prone to panic. The murals were enormous. Just how much blood would they have taken to create? The timid Jiang, Shr-neeng also shuddered, but he quickly came to his senses. No, I don't think so. Take a sniff. If they'd been painted with blood, the entire chamber would stink. That's true. It doesn't smell like blood. Lunianqi calmed down as he inhaled. After that, other details became apparent. For example, the way the mural's ink shone a bright red. Dried blood on the walls would have turned brown by now. Xuanmin regarded the 2 walls. Cinnabar. Painting a tomb with blood and animal parts could easily be explained, but the choice of cinnabar was a strange one because the pigment was known for its protective qualities against evil spirits. By painting the murals with cinnabar, the builder hadn't aimed to bring peace to the interred or assist them in passing on. Instead, they had trapped them in eternal unrest, never to reincarnate. It was an act of terrible malice. Jiang Shr-neeng had never set foot in a mausoleum like this, nor was he familiar with local customs. However, he was knowledgeable about cinnabar. Back in the clinic, he'd grown up surrounded by medicine and medical practices. Even without going out of his way to study medicinal ingredients, he'd committed many of the effects to memory. And he enjoyed browsing through related texts during his spare time, which naturally touched on cinnabar. Using cinnabar to paint beasts, Jiang Shr-neeng muttered. How much did they hate the interred to do this to them? But Xuanmin only waved a hand. Perhaps the evil spirits inside were up to no good. If whoever was buried here refused to rest, then the builder might have had no choice but to use cinnabar to secure some peace. Rash remarks were always unwise, so Jiang Shr-neeng and Lu Nianqi ceased speculating. They noticed that Xuanmin had shifted his attention from the murals to behind the stone door, and they rushed to follow him. The moment he saw what was there, Lu Nianqi's face paled. There was indeed something behind the stone door preventing it from fully opening, but it wasn't an object. It was people. 2 people, one old, the other young. The elderly man lay curled on the ground, one hand clutching his shoulder. His clothes were muddy and torn in several places, while dark bruises mottled the back of his hand. He might have hit it while falling. Meanwhile, the young man was slumped against the wall, his eyes squeezed shut and his lips pallid. He looked frail, perhaps even more so than Jiang Shr-neeng, dreadfully thin, cheekbones gaunt and jutting. In one hand, he clenched a bundle of tangled twigs, fastened together using red string. If ShooANNE had peered out of the pouch, he would have recognized the twigs fastened with string, as well as the slumped youth. It was none other than Lu Shiju, the person they were searching for. Shiju! Lu Nianqi was momentarily stunned, then threw himself in front of his brother. Not knowing if he should touch Lu Shiju, Nianqi hesitated. He examined his brother closely. When he determined that there were no serious injuries visible, he could hold back no longer and began to shake Lu Shiju's shoulder. Shiju! Lu Shiju, wake up! Lu Nianqi shouted. When Lu Shiju still remained unresponsive, he switched to shoving the old man on the ground. Old man Liu! Old man Liu, wake up! Jiang Shr-neeng stepped forward. Let me take a look. However, as he bent down to check, the wan Lu Shiju was roused by all the shaking and struggled to open his eyes. Curled on the ground beside him, old man Liu also showed signs of awakening. Perhaps he dreamed of falling, for his feet jerked and his eyes snapped wide open. He stared blankly for a moment through cloudy eyes before slowly pushing himself up. Jiang Shr-neeng bent to lend him a hand, helping him to sit upright. Lu Shiju and old man Liu stared at each other for a while, then looked at the newcomers, their eyes bewildered. Perhaps they'd been in a daze for too long and their minds had yet to catch up. Jiang Shr-neeng and Xuanmin studied Lu Shiju's actions. It was indeed uncanny, watching his movements. They'd never have guessed that he was blind. Lu Nianqi suddenly slapped Lu Shiju's shoulder. Have you gone stupid? Can't you see my chi? You can't even recognize me now? His forceful slap seemed to jolt Lu Shiju back to his senses. Nianqi? He muttered hoarsely. Lu Shiju stared at his brother for a long time, his eyes unmoving. No matter how one looked at his eyes, they appeared untouched by illness. When fixed on Lu Nianqi, the depths of his irises seemed to shine. There was no difference between his gaze and that of a person who could see. Maybe his eyes were just a little darker, but that was all. However, Jiang Shr-neeng began to notice that Lu Shiju did exhibit some habits common among the blind. He was slow to recognize his brother. His pupils flickered as he looked Lu Nianqi up and down, over and over. Then he reached out and pressed his fingertips to his brother's forehead and felt around. Lu Nianqi sucked in a breath and gritted his teeth. Don't touch me there! I hit my forehead. You won't be able to find the mole." At those words, Xuanmin studied Lu Nianqi's face. Like he had said, the smattering of moles between his brows had been rubbed raw and scabbed over, changing the texture of the area significantly. So Lu Shiju grabbed Lu Nianqi's hand and brought it toward his face, ready to read his palm. Lu Nianqi tugged his hand back and frowned. "Don't touch my hand either. I cut it open on the boat here. Just when it was a bit better, I reopened the wound when I fell. Keep pressing on it like that, and I will be injured forever." Lu Shiju silently withdrew his hand and nodded, as if he'd confirmed that the youth before him really was his brother. "Lu Nianqi," he said, sounding out every syllable. There was no question in his tone this time. Back in the courtyard, Lu Nianqi had shed tears in his panic. However, now that he'd finally found Lu Shiju, he reverted to his peevish attitude, acting like he hadn't come to find Lu Shiju of his own volition. The sight left young Shr-neeng speechless. He soon discovered that Lu Shiju was no better. Once Lu Nianqi helped him to his feet, the first thing he did was shove Lu Nianqi's hand off his arm, as though disdaining his assistance. There was no warmth in his actions. In fact, they were entirely callous. What was wrong with him? Jiang Shr-neeng stared at the two brothers in frustration. He understood what Xian had meant when he said they weren't close. Still, Jiang Shr-neeng wasn't oblivious. He could recognize sincerity when he saw it. The anxiety Lu Nianqi had shown back at their residence, the fleeting look of relief that flashed over Lu Shiju's face when he recognized his brother, neither of those were faked. So why, after Lu Shiju got up, did they have to put on this show of uncaring coldness? Once he was on his feet, Lu Shiju asked Old Man Liu how he was doing, then busied himself with his bundle of twigs, ignoring everyone else. Xuanmin scrutinized him, then Old Man Liu, and his brows furrowed a little. "Master, weren't you and Shr-neeng looking for this young man, Shiju?" Jiang Shr-neeng felt compelled to remind Xuanmin. He'd seen Xuanmin's furrowed brow, even if he didn't know what it meant. Xuanmin nodded, then pulled the golden marble from his pouch. Xuanmin's head was spinning from all his rolling around in the pouch. When he'd been a paper doll, he could sense the subtle changes in the marble due to Xuanmin's influence. Now that he was inside the marble, he realized that the changes were actually anything but subtle. At first, he felt as if he'd been submerged in a hot spring, the waters beneath him bubbling with steam, leaving him warm and comfortable. However, over time, the temperature seemed to rise higher and higher to the point of scalding him. "This isn't a hot spring," Xian realized with a jolt. "I'm being boiled into a damn dragon meat stew." Alas, it was too late for regrets. There was no escape. The soup seemed almost vicious. As he continued to soak, he imagined limbs went limp, and he could barely lift them anymore. With all this going on, he had barely paid attention to what was happening outside the pouch. Naturally, he was ignorant about what Xuanmin and the others were doing or whom they'd encountered, which left him little room to butt in. Just as he was about to dissolve into broth, Xuanmin's hand dove in to save him. Xuanmin was rather unusual. While his fingers felt no warmer than an ordinary person's, perhaps even slightly cooler, the region around his hip underneath the pouch had somehow managed to roast the golden marble to toasty perfection. Gripped in Xuanmin's hand, Xian breathed a sigh of release. No more heat at last. His spirit cooled down as well, and the fog in his mind cleared. He rolled in Xuanmin's palm for a while to speed up the cooling process, then came to a stop and looked around him. His gaze filtered through the marble's golden surface. "Lu Shiju," Xian said doubtfully. "You found him so easily." Xuanmin said. With his mind still the consistency of molten soup, Xian's reactions were sluggish. It took a moment before he replied. "Oh, that's wonderful. Perfect. You're even carrying your sticks, so you can find someone for me." He slowly rolled himself over, then spoke to Xuanmin. "Pay him, bald donkey." Xuanmin didn't reply to that audacious comment. But eventually, he pulled out several silver pieces. "I'll pay you back in gold later," ShooANNE promised. Lu Shiju darted his eyes from Xuanmin to ShooANNE to his brother, then nodded. "Take the offer. Don't fleece him." He looked 17 or 18, not yet mature, but he had his share of eccentricities. Since he needed to support his family, charging for his divination services was a must, but he didn't set a fixed price. His customers could pay in gold, silver, or copper, whichever they chose. Choosing copper meant the price was 3 copper coins. Using silver, it was 3 silver pieces. If you stupidly wished to offer gold, the price was still 3 pieces. ShooANNE belonged in the stupid category. Every time he patronized the boy's services, he'd offered him 3 golden beads. Lu Nianqi took the 3 silver pieces without fuss and tried to slip them into Lu Shiju's pocket. Lu Shiju stopped him, saying, "My robe's ripped. You keep it for now. Don't be greedy." "Who's greedy?" Lu Nianqi said with a scowl. Lu Shiju ignored him to look toward Xuanmin. "What should I be divining?" Xuanmin handed him the golden marble. "This marble," ShooANNE said. "It has passed through several hands. I wish to know where those people are." Lu Shiju didn't take the marble. Instead, he crouched down with his bundled twigs clutched in one hand. Staring at the marble intently, he slowly moved the twigs over the ground. After watching this for a while, Jiang Shr-neeng noticed Lu Shiju wasn't drawing on the ground with the twigs. The twigs were moving by themselves. Lu Shiju's fingers only lightly encircled them. Jiang Shr-neeng watched the sticks while crisscrossing lines and scattered circles emerged on the ground. At last, the twigs fell to the ground with a thump. Lu Shiju frowned before picking them up. He traced the marks on the ground with his fingers, his eyes half closed and lips moving soundlessly, as if he were calculating something. When he was done, he raised his eyes to the marble in Xuanmin's hand. "Strange. I pinpointed the whereabouts of 4 people, but I couldn't find the last one at all. It's like they don't exist." "That means there were 5 in total," ShooANNE said to himself. "Well, good then. Tell me about the 4 you found." Lu Shiju nodded. "One is a fisherman. The second I couldn't find. The third was a sorcerer, and the 4th was a man from the county office who you should have met before, named Liu. The 5th is this master here." "Oh, just great. I knew about those 4 even without the divination," ShooANNE thought. Aloud, he asked, "Where are they now?" Lu Shiju traced the marks on the ground as he slowly replied, "The fisherman is currently in Anting Prefecture, just 1 river away. The sorcerer is cultivating in a small cave on Mount Panlong in the Shu region. As for the county scribe named Liu," he ran his fingers over the ground, and his brows knitted, then relaxed. "Scribe Liu was caught in a fire last night. He won't survive past today. As for the master, I don't think I need to tell you." His explanation done, Lu Shiju withdrew his hand and looked at ShooANNE. Jiang Shr-neeng was shocked. "Scribe Liu won't survive past today?" He'd heard old lady Liu talk about how debts must be repaid, but he hadn't expected it to really happen, let alone so quickly. Lu Shiju traced the ground again at his words. Right. He won't live past today. He's currently bedridden in one of the side wings of his home." The Jiang family had perished in a fire, their bodies reduced to ash. They must have endured the agonizing torment of burning alive. Liu Chong had languished every day in that side building, suffocated by a heavy shroud of yin energy. To siphon off many years' worth of fortune, his father had nearly cost Liu Chong his life in the process. Scribe Liu's time had run out. He would perish from his burns, his eyes falling shut within the side building where he lay. Truly, all debts must be repaid. "Anything else you wish to know?" Lu Shiju asked ShooANNE. ShooANNE shook his head, causing the marble to roll a little. "I know everything I need to know." Lu Shiju then looked at the others. "What about you?" Hearing this, Xuanmin picked ShooANNE up and placed him back into the pouch. As the marble slipped from Xuanmin's cool fingers, ShooANNE thought, "If only I had arms to reach out with. I could hold on for just a little longer. Unfortunately, the marble was smooth and round and rolled right to the bottom of the pouch, and thus the dragon meat stew started boiling away again. Having dealt with the golden marble, Xuanmin pulled out a folded sheet of paper from his lapels. It was the same brushstroke packed sheet he'd unfolded in Gui Yun Hall. There were characters and even rough sketches. Some had been jotted down hastily, while others were written in neat rows. He handed it to Lu Shiju without folding it, but the corner of the folded sheet was exposed, revealing the characters written there. Find them. I wish to know who gave me this piece of paper, please, Xuanmin said in a low voice. Lu Nianqi took another 3 silver pieces from him in accordance with his rules. Lu Shiju looked at the paper while touching the twigs to the ground, letting them write. Though Xuexian was tucked back in the pouch, he was curious about Xuanmin. As his mind had yet to broil away, he perked up his ears, listening to the voices outside. After a moment, just as Xuexian's mind was starting to melt again, he heard Lu Shiju's voice drift in. You did. Xuexian didn't know what to say. He had the fortune teller divine the paper he'd left for himself? There was definitely something wrong with him. Wait, that reminded Xuexian of what Jiang Shr-neeng had mentioned earlier. The scent that clung to Xuanmin was reminiscent of medicine used to treat dissociation. Could this bald donkey really be an amnesiac? If so, he's too fucking good at acting normal. Just like Xuexian, both Jiang Shr-neeng and Lu Nianqi could not help staring at Xuanmin. But Jiang Shr-neeng felt that he was being rude, so he hurriedly turned away, trying to wipe all thoughts from his mind. Xuexian didn't return their stares, seeming oblivious to them. His expression as composed as ever, he asked Lu Shiju, Are you sure no one else has touched it? Lu Shiju ran his hands over the ground again to check, then nodded. No one else. Thank you very much. Xuanmin returned the gesture. Now that the divinations were over, Lu Nianqi spoke up. You've been away from home for half a month. All because you fell into this accursed place, huh? But Lu Shiju didn't seem to hear. He pointed to the door behind him. We can't leave the way we came. We have to go through here. Lu Nianqi glared at him, frustrated, then walked off to the side. Lu Shiju disregarded his brother and pressed forward, down the hallway toward the door that led deeper into the tomb. Old man Liu followed him, and the two walked a few steps before looking back at Xuanmin and the others. We've explored a lot of the route here and almost got to the end last time, Lu Shiju explained. This time, we should be able to leave. After saying so, he cocked his head, signaling for them to follow. Xuanmin observed them for a moment before starting after them. As he walked, he nodded at Jiang Shr-neeng and Lu Nianqi. Stay behind me. The two of them obeyed, trailing behind him like a little tail, nervous yet also reluctant to get too close, lest they step on his snow-white monk's robe. Lu Nianqi's face was full of indignation still, so Jiang Shr-neeng tried to console him. Your brother must be exhausted. He's probably tried to find a way out many times. Look at his robe. It's wet and starting to dry. It must have been soaked and still heavy. He's conserving the strength he needs to walk. That's why he's speaking as little as possible. Looking down at the wet marks on the ground, Lu Nianqi snorted in response, but he forced down his frustrated expression. Lu Shiju stepped in front of another stone door and placed his hand on it. He stared at it, then blinked once. It might be a little dangerous. Remember to follow me. At the same time Lu Shiju blinked, Lu Nianqi couldn't help doing the same. Shaking his head, he rubbed hard at his eyes as if to wipe something away. Xuanmin caught this out the corner of his eye. What's wrong? My vision got blurry all of a sudden, said Lu Nianqi. He blinked hard and mumbled. It's better now. It doesn't matter. We need to get out of here first. Xuanmin observed the scabs on Lu Nianqi's forehead and then looked at Lu Shiju. Jiang Shr-neeng followed Xuanmin's gaze and glanced back and forth between the two. The scholar suddenly felt like something was wrong. Just when he was about to pinpoint the reason, Lu Shiju shoved open the stone door. The hollow rumble of the door grinding open echoed through the hall, and the talisman paper in Xuanmin's hand flared before blinking out without warning. With their surroundings plunged into darkness, everyone halted. Jiang, Shr-neeng, and Lunianqi gasped, and their breath caught in their throats. Where it stayed, they were too afraid to exhale. A cold wind surged through the open stone door, carrying with it a strange, indescribable stench that was damp and full of decay, chilling enough for goosebumps to erupt over their skin. Even Xian, still boiling away, felt it somewhat. For him, the chilly wind was a welcome relief for his overheated mind. However, it was only a temporary one, a superficial stopgap that didn't address the underlying symptoms. As soon as the wind passed, he began bubbling once more. Such intense heat would render an ordinary person's mind incapable of functioning, and Xian was no exception. Rocking back and forth within the pouch, he simmered in a dreamlike state as he wondered how to free himself, even if only to catch a breath. At that moment, he had little care for his own dignity, and he groused to himself that Xuanmin hadn't reached in to let Xian cool himself against his fingers. With his mind this useless, Xian's mouth moved as he complained internally, leading him to mutter all of his subconscious thoughts, though they came out slurred thanks to his daze. Rather like the repetitive mumblings of a senile old woman, he echoed the same phrases without variation. Once the cold wind passed and the flame went out, Jiang, Shr-neeng, and the others held their breaths. The room was deathly silent as they stood as straight and rigid as wooden planks. That was when Xian's incessant mumblings drifted through the air, accompanied by the chilling wind. The effect was quite potent. "Ooh, what is that sound?" Lunianqi asked. "Where is it coming from?" "Master, can you light another candle?" came Jiang, Shr-neeng's anxious voice. The sudden darkness had enshrouded everyone's figures. It was as if all their companions had been swallowed, leaving each one of them alone. It was said that when silence reached an extreme at night, one's senses would grow disoriented. Faraway noises would seem to be in your ear, making it difficult to discern distance and direction. When Xuanmin first heard the mumbling, his hand paused on the paper. After a moment, he realized that the dazed murmur was coming from the pouch at his waist. What was that evil spirit up to now? Xuanmin frowned as he listened, only to realize that Xian was muttering a single phrase over and over again like a hornet's incessant buzz. "Bald donkey." "What's this about?" Xuanmin wondered. At a loss, he chose to ignore Xian and pulled out a new sheet of talisman paper, lighting it once more. But the moment the flame flickered to life, another gust of wind blew past, and the light vanished. "Don't waste your time. It won't stay on." Lu Shiju's voice was dull as he gathered his strength to shove hard against the stone door. In contrast to the all-consuming blackness swallowing them, the chamber behind the door glowed with a faint, ethereal light. This light was soft and feeble, like a fine dusting of frost sprinkled over charcoal wood, barely illuminating the silhouettes of those present. Lu Shiju, at the head of the party, said no more. He simply walked inside. Xuanmin patted the tireless murmurer at his waist, then told Jiang, Shr-neeng, and Lunianqi without looking back, "Stay close." He, too, stepped through the tomb door. Jiang, Shr-neeng, and Lunianqi, afraid of being left behind, dashed after them. As Lunianqi walked, he felt something beneath his foot like a small pebble. He stumbled slightly while a loud roar echoed from the stone door grinding shut behind them. The rumbling shook him to the core, and he almost turned tail and ran right then and there. Despite some dim lighting, the chamber remained dark and dismal. The size of the place was impossible to gauge, nor could they discern what lay at their feet, the surroundings enveloping them, or rather anything loomed overhead. "Wait, are those holes up there?" Jiang, Shr-neeng interjected, pointing up. The stone chamber was soundless, and his words echoed multiple times, causing him to freeze in place. His hand remained pointed at the ceiling as he quailed, too terrified to move. "Keep your voice down," Lu Shiju said quietly. With his whispering, the echoes faded, and the chamber felt less empty and eerie. Xuanmin looked up to see 7 tiny holes drilled into the ceiling. He reached out into the void above them. "They're not holes," he said. "If they had been, the wind wouldn't have blown in that direction." "Night pearls," he declared. He studied the luminescent pearls for a while, then added, "Exactly 7 of them. Their positions matched the Ursa Major constellation." That's hilarious. I've been kind of voicing this man like Cui Wuxu and all of this is... Okay, anyway. At these words, understanding dawned on Jiang, Shr-neeng, and the others as well. They could now see that the pearls formed the shape of the Big Dipper. Their cool light shining down on them was far paler than the warm glow of the sun. "It's still so dark, even with the 7 night pearls hanging there. Just how high is the ceiling here?" Jiang, Shr-neeng muttered. "You can tell by listening to the echoes," Lu Shiju said from in front of him. "The path ahead is difficult to traverse, so be careful not to step on the wrong stones, and make sure not to fall." Lu Nianqi, who had his foot in midair, immediately jerked it backward. "Wait, what do you mean by the wrong stones? And don't fall." "Especially you," added Lu Shiju. "You must not look down." Lu Nianqi was stunned by this rather unreasonable request. They could barely see the outlines of their fingers here. How were they supposed to walk without looking at their feet? How was he supposed to take any steps? However, while they talked, they slowly began to adapt to the darkness, and the outlines of their surroundings gradually became visible. They were standing on a stone platform that resembled a cliff, wide enough to fit 2 rows of people, but narrow enough that if Lu Shiju and Xuanmin took another step forward, they would be sent plummeting off the edge. "I'm a ghost. I can't die a second time," Jiang, Shr-neeng whispered to himself over and over. With that, he mustered enough courage to take a half step forward. He stayed a shoulder's width behind Xuanmin, squinting ahead to make out what he could. Before them, the stone platform led to a massive hollow in the ground. Shimmering ripples of light glinted off its surface. That must be water. However, they could see neither how deep the water was nor where it come from. If they fell in, they might very well never resurface. Strangest were the round objects that resembled heavy melons bobbing in the water, each one well separated from the others. Jiang, Shr-neeng could only discern their general shape, but he couldn't tell if they were stones or something else. A sweep of his gaze told him there were at least 100 of them, and they seemed to be placed in an array. Within the dark waters in front of Lu Shiju's feet were stone platforms, tall and thin, each one allowing space for a single foot. They stood scattered like the uneven pillars for a lion dance, stretching out before them. This was the only path they could take. Jiang, Shr-neeng glanced around, but couldn't see any hint of the other side. "Just this long path?" He felt his legs weaken, and he instinctively turned to look at Xuanmin. Xuanmin was surveying the surroundings, his brow furrowed. It was unclear what he was thinking. In the darkness, Jiang, Shr-neeng couldn't see much of his expression beyond the slight knit of his brow. Lu Shiju spoke up again. "I don't need my eyes. I can see the qi here, which is much more reliable than sight. Stay close. We must move quickly." With that, he stepped onto the first stone platform. Old Man Liu followed closely behind. Years of rowing had left him with a slight hunch, and his stooped silhouette radiated an aura of wizened old age. He was utterly composed and hadn't said a word. In fact, he wasn't even short of breath. Seeing this, Jiang, Shr-neeng felt like maybe he, too, had nothing to fear. Xuanmin waited for a moment. Once Lu Shiju and Old Man Liu had taken their 3rd step, he slowly raised his foot to take his first. Reluctantly, Jiang, Shr-neeng and Lu Nianqi followed him. Simply observing what lay ahead had been daunting enough. Actually, standing on the stone platforms brought a whole new level of fear. Jiang, Shr-neeng couldn't resist looking down and was immediately struck by terror. The stone platform was tall and narrow, making it all too easy to plunge into the dark, unfathomable waters lurking below. The surface of the water lay about 10 yards beneath their feet. Just one fleeting glance made Jiang Shr-neeng's head spin, and a buzzing dizziness overtook him. The stone platforms they stood on had to be carefully chosen. Which ones were safe and which ones were to be avoided were determined entirely by Lu Shiju as he guided them along. Doubt lingered in Jiang Shr-neeng's mind. Lu Shiju and Old Man Liu were nearly 20 yards ahead of Xuanmin. Could Xuanmin really see which stones they were stepping on? After he hopped in this manner for 7 or 8 steps, an even more horrifying discovery struck him. Why do I feel like the water is rising? Jiang Shr-neeng's voice was feeble, like a man on death's door. Water? In front of him, Lu Nianqi froze, his body turning rigid at his words. There's water beneath us? Don't look down. Lu Shiju's voice rang out from ahead, urgency lacing his words. Oh no. Only then did Jiang Shr-neeng recall Lu Shiju's warning from earlier, but it was too late. He watched helplessly as Lu Nianqi suddenly hunkered down and clutched at the stone platform, unwilling to take another step. I can't go on. I want to turn back. I want to go home. He shuffled around, ready to retreat. The stone platform behind him was occupied by Jiang Shr-neeng. In his moment of panic, Lu Nianqi leapt to the platform next to where Jiang Shr-neeng stood. Don't! Jiang Shr-neeng cried. He moved to yank Lu Nianqi back, but he was too slow and almost sent himself tumbling off the edge. Crushed rubble rolled by his feet and tumbled into the inky waters below. Plop! Tiny splashes blossomed like flowers in the water. Nestled in Xuanmin's pouch, Xuan felt something within himself pulse, as if his heart had sprouted inside his chest, even though he was a wispy spirit lacking any form and possessed no organs whatsoever. He mumbled something in his haze, then descended into a mental state even more chaotic than before. The sound of rocks hitting the water startled Lu Nianqi. Something came over him while he shuddered, his voice tinged with panic. Before he could finish, the once calm and boundless black waters beneath him roared to life, as if a long-dead creature had emerged from the depths. Towering waves surged upward, crashing mercilessly over everyone. They were instantly drenched with a great splash. At that moment, a sound. Thump. Another heartbeat. It was as if Xian had developed arteries and veins. He felt blood surge within his body and a fiery warmth crawl up his spine. Soon, even this sensation was overwhelmed by a flood of limitless heat. Hurry! Lu Shiju's voice pierced through the cacophony of roaring waves. Jiang Shr-neeng was clinging to the edge of his platform, but before he could respond, he was struck on the back of his neck, transforming him into a piece of soaked paper. He watched helplessly as Xuanmin seized him and then grabbed the panicking Lu Nianqi so he could carry them forward with long strides. The water surged ever higher, and the dark waves showed no sign of abating. Xuanmin wove between the towering swells, never stopping for a moment, his steps brisk and steady. It's not enough, Lu Shiju shouted from up ahead. We need to move faster. The water is rising too quickly, much faster than last time. I don't know if we can reach the end. Hurry! Before he could finish speaking, another massive wave crashed down. Lu Nianqi swallowed several mouthfuls of water, his body completely drenched. The stench of damp decay clung to his nose. The waves persisted, crashing relentlessly. In no time at all, the water line crept up to his feet, then to his calves. Just as he was wiping the water from his face, another wave swept over him. It was as though he would never be dry again, trapped in an inescapable deluge and fated to drown within it. The sensation was hauntingly familiar, bringing with it a rush of disorientation, sending him back 7 or 8 years to that moment in the river. Xuanmin glowered at the youth struggling in his hands. The rolling waves seemed to have triggered some traumatic memories in Lu Nianqi. He was screaming like a man gone mad and dragging them down. Xuanmin raised his hand, poised to strike the back of Lu Nianqi's neck. Bang! The dazed Xian jerked awake again. He felt a mysterious sensation spreading through his soul, as if he had drawn up something familiar from the depths, then absorbed it. It flowed through his non-existent blood vessels, swelling and growing hot. "What the hell?" ShooANNE grumbled to himself. "What is this? Rising dough?" It was like he was about to burst out of the marble. Bang! Bang! The sounds echoed in succession, and this time, it wasn't just ShooANNE who noticed. The group rushing toward the opposite bank also heard it. What's happening? Even Lu Shiju, who'd taken this path before, seemed astonished. Something is striking the stone platform. Xuanmin paused briefly before quickening his pace even more. Hurry. Lu Shiju was correct. Something had awakened in the depths of the inky water and was slamming against the base of the stone platform. With each impact, the platform shuddered and grew increasingly unstable. The tremors were so violent the group could barely keep their footing. Wham! An even louder crash echoed, and the stone platforms groaned in unison, followed by the sound of cracking stone. Not just the platform beneath them, either. For some reason, every single platform in front of and behind them crumbled at that very moment. They didn't even have the time to struggle before falling into the water. As the water flooded over his head, Xuanmin just barely heard something from the pouch at his waist. A sizzling noise, like a spoonful of water splashing onto hot iron. This murky lake was filled with no ordinary water. It stung his eyes, making opening them unbearable. He tried anyway, and after he blinked a couple of times, his vision recovered just in time for him to see a smooth object rolling from the pouch at his waist. Upon hitting the water, it plummeted straight down as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. Losing his hands and feet hadn't made this evil spirit any less of a pain. Xuanmin reached out to grab the marble at once. However, just as his palm wrapped around it, an enormous weight bore down upon Xuanmin's hand, like he wasn't holding a marble, but Mount Tai itself. Before he could react, the marble sent him plunging toward the depths. The water was astonishingly deep and cold. In seconds, the chill pierced his skin and filled his bones. The freezing water also jolted ShooANNE's mind, clearing it, though he had yet to figure out what was going on. In his confusion, he had the audacity to ask Xuanmin, "Bald donkey, why am I in the water?" "Hell if I know," Xuanmin thought. "And why are you here as well?" Xuanmin didn't say a word. Even hell wouldn't know the answer to that question. Ignorant inside the golden marble, ShooANNE had nothing to fear and was free to speak as he pleased. But the moment Xuanmin opened his mouth, he'd swallow water. Choking was the least of his worries. His main issue was that he had no idea where this water came from or how long it'd just been sitting here. He didn't need a brain to know it wouldn't be too clean. He'd rather drown than drink it. The marble plunged down at full speed, dragging them along, until it crashed into the bottom of the pool. Despite the thick layer of mud to cushion the impact, Xuanmin's fingers still spasmed and curled from the pain. Anyone else would probably have found their fingers shattered. In his daze, ShooANNE could sense that something was insulating him, and he tried to speak. But the burning heat of his expanding body consumed his senses, and the constant tremors left him dizzy and nauseous. He flailed aimlessly in the mud, driven by some instinct, urgently searching for something. However, his thrashing only disturbed the dirt, turning the entire depths murky. Never mind finding anything. It'd be a miracle if he didn't end up lost himself. "I'm sick of all this mud," ShooANNE spat in his daze. His naturally irritable disposition had worsened, turning his tone thick with hostility. "Where is it? Where is it? Where is it?" He didn't even know what he was searching for, yet that phrase looped endlessly within his mind. Bang! With every thunderous impact, ShooANNE grew more frustrated. The muck churned into a frenzy, and the water grew increasingly turbid. Xuanmin lost track of the golden marble after pulling his hand back. The sheer depths of this pool, combined with their endless descent, no ordinary person could endure it, and even Xuanmin was no exception. Lulianqi was the first to succumb to the water. He'd escaped Xuanmin's strike, but not the suffocating sensation of drowning. After thrashing around madly in Xuanmin's grasp and swallowing several mouthfuls of water, he gradually fell silent. Next was Jiang Shr-neeng, who'd reverted to paper form. As he was a ghost, he didn't need to breathe, but the relentless tremors and the stirring of the water were threatening to turn his body into a pulp. Finally, there was Xuanmin, who was frowning. Just as the world began to fade with his consciousness, an ear-splitting noise pierced through the muddy depths from not far away. The sound sliced like a blade in the dark, turbid waters and echoed throughout the tomb. For a brief moment, the dazed Xuanmin was dragged back to clarity. That distant roar was familiar. He was certain he'd heard it somewhere before. However, just as that thought flashed through his mind, the murky waters began to swirl with a terrible speed. Like a hole had been drilled into the bottom of the pool, a massive maelstrom formed, and the water surged with tremendous force toward that point. The vortex swept away everything floating within the inky depths, including Xuanmin. The force of its suction was akin to being shackled with 1,000 tons of weight. No one could resist it. So, being soaked to pulp was the good ending. The bad ending was getting torn to pieces. Jiang Shr-neeng thought in despair as he was dragged into the swirling current. Those in human bodies, like Lulianqi and Xuanmin, also experienced the strain. Each of their joints was newly pushed to the limit. If the whirlpool intensified further, their bones would crack and dislocate. An uncanny, clear roar accompanied the massive waves of the whirlpool. The sheer might and fury behind it would strike awe into anyone's heart. Jiang Shr-neeng thought it almost felt as if they were not in a sealed, pitch-dark tomb, but rather out in the vast and boundless sea, witnessing a waterspout. Jiang Shr-neeng couldn't actually see anything as his world churned around him, and the vortex's scale was confined to the pool. Yet that word flashed through his mind regardless. A waterspout, the legendary phenomenon caused by dragons drawing in the waters of the sea. He'd never seen one in reality, only glimpsed it a few times in the pages of his books, but he couldn't help but think of it. Before those nonsensical thoughts could go anywhere, he was sucked into the depths of the whirlpool. Crack! One crisp sound later, Jiang Shr-neeng's vision went dark, and he lost consciousness. The echo of thundering waves lingered for a long time, resonating throughout the vast tomb and droning on and on. Finally, after a long while, they receded, and the tomb fell back into a deathly silence. On the stone ceiling, the 7 luminous pearls of the Big Dipper still emitted their feeble glow, faintly radiating over the area above the former pool. The once unfathomable black waters had been completely drained, leaving nothing in their wake. In mere moments, the depths had been sucked dry, and the narrow stone platforms that connected both sides had shattered into haphazard piles of rubble strewn at the bottom of the hollow. The layer of mud at the bottom was now heaped in the corners, as if someone had impatiently swept it aside. With the soft mud removed, the stone tiles lining the bottom were revealed. One section of the tiles had been shattered, exposing black soil. Nestled within that soil was a shining gold marble, quivering gently. Strewn around the marble were several unconscious people, their complexions ashen. Xuanmin and the others. A moment later, the golden marble gurgled, then spat out a mouthful of water, breaking the deathly silence in the tomb. An eerie sigh swiftly followed right after. Xian curled up inside the marble and released a long breath. He felt like he was about to explode. While he'd been thrashing around at the pool bottom, his consciousness had been one big muddle. He'd vaguely sensed that he'd shattered some stone tiles and smashed something within the black soil, then pulled it into the marble. In that moment, he experienced an immense sense of satisfaction, as if he'd finally taken a bite of something he'd long yearned for. That burning desire, too, was temporarily suppressed. However, there was one unfortunate thing. While the golden marble had been absorbing the object in the soil, he'd really overdone it and sucked up all the water in the pool as well. Now he was bloated to the point of discomfort. This was a real nuisance. The water hadn't entered his stomach. It'd been absorbed by the marble. So, shouldn't the marble have shattered? Why was he full to the point of bursting instead? It made no sense. As he rolled back and forth in frustration, Xuanmin, lying unconscious at the bottom of the pool, twitched his fingers, then suddenly opened his eyes. For some reason, his eyes looked cautious and oddly uncertain when he opened them, as if he had forgotten where he was, who was with him, and what he was doing. He stared at the Big Dipper in the ceiling above him, then abruptly sat up. ShooANNE heard his movements and struggled to roll out of the black soil, clattering along the bottom of the pool before coming to a stop next to Xuanmin. "Excuse me, bald donkey. Have you any talismans to help with digestion? I'll accept elixirs too." He looked up at Xuanmin, waiting for his reply. However, Xuanmin only stared at him for a moment. "Where did this evil spirit come from? Why are you hiding inside a marble?" What kind of nonsense is this?" ShooANNE wondered. He stopped rolling and turned stiff as a stone egg as he stared at Xuanmin in disbelief. "Are you joking?" At the shock from Xuanmin's words, the bloated feeling vanished, like ShooANNE had successfully digested all the water in an instant. He paused in surprise, then circled around Xuanmin twice, scrutinizing him. Had he drowned and ended up possessed by a ghost? After a beat, he stopped to study Xuanmin's profile, his gaze fixed on the man's neck. The light in the tomb was dim, and while that might have hindered an ordinary person, ShooANNE could see many details clearly. "What's that thing on your neck?" he asked. At some unknown time, it seemed like Xuanmin had developed a strange mark on the side of his neck that resembled a bird's-eye view of a spider. ShooANNE recalled that Xuanmin did have a small mole on his neck, but it had looked nothing like this. Xuanmin frowned at the question and touched the side of his neck. When his fingers brushed over that spot, the spider seemed to dissolve beneath the warmth of his fingers, retracting its legs and transforming back into a simple mole. ShooANNE realized that the so-called spider was the result of thin blood vessels extending from the mole, which resembled the delicate legs of an arachnid. As the blood vessels vanished, Xuanmin frowned and closed his eyes, pinching the space between his brows like he was dizzy. He remained in that position, motionless. ShooANNE was reminded of the events at Guiyuan Hall. At that time, Xuanmin had also suffered from a spate of dizziness when he went to meditate in his chair. For a long time, he'd sat there without moving. ShooANNE rolled around Xuanmin a couple more times, but found nothing unusual beyond that small mole. "Just what kind of illness is this?" ShooANNE had never seen anything like it before. After a long while, Xuanmin stirred again. He shifted his fingers to his temples and rubbed them before scowling as he forced his eyes open. ShooANNE was staring up at Xuanmin, observing his every move, so when Xuanmin opened his eyes, he caught ShooANNE's gaze. "The amount of trouble you can cause without arms and legs," Xuanmin said, expressionless. "You truly deserve to be exorcised, evil spirit." "This bald donkey should just return to being confused." Xuanmin began to stretch the hand that had been hanging at his side. He cracked each knuckle one by one, glancing at ShooANNE dispassionately before moving to the next. Only then did ShooANNE understand what the fleshy cushion he'd landed on earlier was. He forced himself to ignore Xuanmin's earlier words. Rolling over, the dragon was ready to ask about the spider mole when he caught sight of a nearby shadow. It was a figure lying sideways, a human-sized stone statue, its head round like a melon's, though the face was crude and ferocious. That in itself was nothing unusual. Stone statues were common sights in tombs. However, the statue had split open upon crashing to the ground, revealing its contents. And if ShooANNE's eyes were working, inside the statue was a person who'd been dead for a very long time. Xuanmin had noticed it as well. He turned his head and scanned the area. only to see that there were hundreds of similar stone statues all lying at the bottom of the hollow. Abruptly, ShooANNE realized how long these bodies had been soaking in the water, and that all of that liquid was within his marble now. A tremor ran through him. Xuanmin rubbed his hands and rose, intending to take a closer look at the stone statues, when he heard the sound of splashing at his feet. Confused, he looked down and saw the motionless marble gushing water, as if it were throwing up. The round object wordlessly spewed out a puddle of clear water, which slowly pooled around Xuanmin's feet. He stared at the marble. When he spoke, his tone betrayed a complicated emotion within. "Are you going to throw up all the water?" ShooANNE ignored him and continued to spout like a listless spring. Xuanmin curled his lips, though his voice was now indifferent. "Will you then bathe in all the water you spat up?" ShooANNE said nothing, but the marble stopped what it was doing. "You really know how to disgust someone," he muttered after a second. "You're too kind. I'm flattered." Xuanmin turned his gaze away and stepped toward a few nearby statues. After some hesitation, ShooANNE rolled after him, hot on his heels. "Pick me up already. I'm so bloated my head is spinning." Xuanmin glanced at the marble that was glistening with water. "After the corpse water on you dries." ShooANNE froze before yelling, "If you keep saying such disgusting things, I'll throw it right on you. Don't test me." "All right, I won't." Xuanmin paused in exasperation, but he still picked the marble up. Then he tossed him right into the pouch, refusing to touch him for a second longer. "How dare you act disgusted by me?" came ShooANNE's muffled voice from inside the pouch. "You were soaking in the water too. You're drenched." Xuanmin stopped for a moment, then sliced open his fingertip without a word. He squeezed several droplets of blood from the wound and used them to draw a simple rune on his palm. Instantly, all the water on him evaporated. His thin hemp robe dried and once again became light as a feather, and even the water on ShooANNE vanished without a trace. His goal achieved, ShooANNE was quite satisfied. What brought him even greater satisfaction was that the curious nature of Xuanmin's hips seemed effective for digestion as well. ShooANNE could feel the object he'd absorbed from the soil slowly merging with the marble and becoming one. During his earlier days, he hadn't even seen what object he was absorbing. Now, he could feel it as it melded into him. The bird thing must have been part of his body. Perhaps it was a piece of his spine, his blood, or a slice of tendon. It wasn't much, and it wasn't complete. Nevertheless, it was slowly joined with the marble. A powerful satisfaction surged through him, and some feeling and warmth returned to the area that should have been his spine, which had been hollow for over half a year. When it came to nurturing spirit, qi, bones, or flesh, there had to be a starting point, akin to how a seed is needed to plant flowers or trees. ShooANNE had spent the better part of the past 6 months refining his qi into a cohesive form. After much effort, he'd finally succeeded in establishing a connection within his spine, enabling his upper body to move as it once had. But qi was different from bone, lacking shape and substance, and he hadn't managed more. This time, however, he could feel the seed taking root within him. Outside of the marble, Xuanmin was inspecting the stone statues. There were too many strewn across the stone tiles for him to inspect each one, so he focused only on those that were damaged. They did not all look the same. After examining around 10, he identified 3 distinct types. Those with glaring eyes of fury, those sporting drooping brows as if weeping, and those wearing wide grins of joy. These 3 types of statues also contained different types of corpses. The ones within the angry statues had no heads, the ones in the sad statues had no legs, and the ones in the happy statues had no hands. "Did you figure something out?" ShooANNE asked. "What purpose do these stone statues serve? They look rather sinister." "I understand a little," Xuanmin said with a frown. ShooANNE was puzzled. "You seem to know about everything. How and why?" Perhaps I read it in a book once. There were over 100 stone statues. They clearly weren't ordinary funerary gifts designed to accompany the dead. Given their careful design, there had to be a purpose to them. Xuanmin recalled a concept like this, although he was unsure of its source. Still, he knew there was a feng shui array capable of reversing one's fate called Flow of 100 Soldiers. If executed properly, it would protect someone from all manners of calamities and guarantee 100 years of prosperity. It was an exceedingly powerful array, but it had one flaw. It was impossibly vile. Few people could bring themselves to execute it because this array required the sacrifice of 300 lives, 100 fierce generals, 100 suffering common folk, and 100 wicked villains. The different faces of the stone statues were corresponded neatly with those three groups. The furious statues were the generals, the sorrowful statues were the common folk, and the laughing statues were the villains. 300 lives. Xuan was taken aback by the sheer scale of the array. That's insane. When humans wish to do evil, they're no less terrifying than I am. Where did they manage to find 300 people? That's no small number. The loss of half that would raise a commotion. Over 100 people missing? Even a blind person would see that something was wrong. Just as he was speaking, a clinking sound came from one of the stone statues Xuanmin was examining, and something fell out. It sounded like a piece of copper or iron. Since a corpse had been carrying it, it was covered in decay and filth. Xuanmin frowned, then pulled off a small section of his robe's hem. Xuan scoffed at the tearing noise. "Keep ripping your robe like that, and soon it'll be a shirt." Of course, he was exaggerating. Xuanmin's robes didn't brush the ground, but they were very long, enough to cover most of his feet. When he walked, they glided over the earth, close but never touching. And each piece he tore off was no bigger than his palm. Even if he did it 17 or 18 times more, his robe wouldn't be that much shorter. But Xuan could never control his tongue, and it was easy to take jabs at Xuanmin from time to time. Picking up the fallen object with the white hemp scrap, Xuanmin held it up to the light and inspected it closely. It was a small iron tag. One side was engraved with a beast's head, while the other carried a name. However, the latter had been scratched out with a knife, rendering it illegible. At Xuanmin's lack of response to his insult, Xuan poked out of the pouch. "Huh? That looks familiar." "You've seen it?" Xuanmin considered pushing the marble back inside, but hearing his words, he held the iron piece out instead. "I remember now," said Xuan. "On the way to Wolong County, we came across many rundown temples in the mountains. We found one of these while we were resting inside. It was even stained in blood. From a battle, I assumed. Later, just before entering Wolong City, the bookworm and I found another one at the foot of the city gates. The tags had been cast from a single mold, so they'd been crafted together and most likely originated from the military. Soldiers danced on the edge of life and death, and everyone who'd been in battle would have spilled blood, fulfilling the requirement for fierce generals. However, the military was strictly regulated. Could 100 soldiers disappear without being reported? After a half-year wandering among the common folk, Xuan knew little about the military, but Xuanmin was aware of some things. Everyone in the military carried one of these iron tags, he explained. First, they were useful for administrative purposes. Second, they served to verify their owners' identities. Third, if their owner perished in battle and their body couldn't be recovered, the tag would substitute for the corpse and be interred in its place. If the soldier didn't perish on the battlefield but grew too old or suffered a serious injury, rendering them unable to fight, they'd be discharged from service. The army wouldn't reclaim their tags, but they'd scratch out the name written upon them. "Where did you hear all this?" Xuan asked. Xuanmin stiffened before shaking his head. "I forgot. I might have overheard something discussing it in the corner of an alley." Xuan found Xuanmin to be quite the oddball. Judging from his spider-shaped mole, he was suffering from some kind of sickness. The way he woke up unable to recognize others implied his condition must have been quite severe. A bald donkey, probably afflicted with dissociation but constantly acting aloof and almighty, who always kept people at a distance, had somehow managed to gather this much information by mingling on the streets? That was rather hard to believe. "Do you look like someone who just chats with strangers?" ShooANNE asked. Before Xuanmin could answer, ShooANNE continued, "No, you don't." Xuanmin's expression remained unchanged as he pressed down on ShooANNE's round head. Or maybe it was his body. Whatever. In any case, he pushed the marble back into the pouch. ShooANNE refused to be silent as he dropped in. So the fierce generals were either old or wounded soldiers. What about the suffering common folk and the wicked villains? "Beggars and bandits." That answer hadn't come from Xuanmin, but another gentle and steady voice. Xuanmin turned to see that Lu Shiju and Old Man Liu had woken up and were walking toward them. Old Man Liu was wizened with age, while Lu Shiju looked even frailer than Jiang Shr-neeng. Had they really come to so quickly? Being tossed by the whirlpool's current and slammed into the pool floor would have been enough to seriously wound anyone, but both of them showed no signs of new injuries. In fact, they looked exactly the same as when Xuanmin had first encountered them behind the stone door. Even the bruises on their bodies and the dampness of their clothes was unchanged. Xuanmin scanned them up and down. He didn't say much, only turned to the remaining 100 or so stone statues and asked, "How do you know?" Lu Shiju raised the bundle of twigs he was holding and shifted his fingers. "I saw it and divined it. I touched a couple of them earlier. These soldiers were intercepted on their way home. They're easy to kidnap. Just say they died in battle and their bodies couldn't be found. That would be enough to erase any suspicion." Regarding beggars and vagrants, no one paid any attention to whether they came or went. Sourcing bandits was even simpler, as the populace was happy to be rid of them. Wherever they were sent, whether to prison or to be put to death, no one would ask any questions. With all three factions in hand, the array had been constructed. Lu Shiju's blind eyes were much more potent than the average person's. He looked around him, then pointed at 2 different locations. "Something's there." Xuanmin walked over and plucked a stone shard from each place where Lu Shiju had pointed. As he brushed his fingers over the surfaces, he could feel runes engraved upon them. Xuanmin held the shards and scrutinized them for a while. "They're familiar," Xuanmin eventually said. "What's familiar?" asked ShooANNE. "The runes. I've seen them elsewhere before." But the light in the tomb was too dim. No matter how hard Xuanmin looked, he could only make out rough outlines. While he was examining the stone shards, Lu Shiju turned to glance at Lu Nianqi, who was unconscious nearby. To Xuanmin, Lu Shiju said, "Nianqi is—" Sensing the hesitation in his tone, Xuanmin finished for him without looking up. "Very afraid of water." "He sure is. I was feeling too sluggish to sense anything earlier," came ShooANNE's lazy voice from the pouch. "But I did hear him screaming his head off." Lu Shiju dropped his gaze. "That was my fault." Alrighty, everyone. That concludes the reading of Chapter 12, Island Tomb. So when we come back, we will be finishing the first volume of Copper Coins with chapters 13 and 14. I hope you all enjoyed. Please let me know your thoughts and reactions in the comments section, and ShooANNE-Mean.